My name is Chris Ferris. I'm an IBM Fellow and CTO for Open Technology for IBM. I'm going to talk a little bit today about IBM's approach to open technology and open source in particular, and why we think it's so fundamental going forward for the development of all software. So prior to joining IBM about 18 years ago, I used to work at Sun Microsystems. And one of the founders of Sun Microsystems was Bill Joy, and he had a saying that has been coined as Joy's Law. He said, no matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. And I think what he meant by this was the fact that you cannot outcompete the rest of the world when they're collaborating together. And that's sort of the fundamental aspect of open source. Another piece of prescience is the writing of Eric Raymond. He wrote in his piece, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, perhaps in the end, the open source culture will triumph simply because the closed source world cannot win an evolutionary arms race with open source communities that can put orders of magnitude more skilled time into a problem. And again, I think this is essentially what Bill was getting at, that communities of engineers from around the globe can out-innovate any single company. They just don't have the resources to compete with the rest of the world. And if we look at sort of the trends that are ongoing today, Red Hat, which is a recent acquisition of IBM's, the largest acquisition of software in the history of software, and they do an annual study of open source in the enterprise. And this year they found that 86% responded that the most innovative companies are using enterprise open source. If you look down in the lower right-hand quadrant, you'll see that 95% of the respondents said that open source is strategically important to their business. And then if we look at the trend over the past couple of years, in terms of the percentage of software that's used, you'll see that there's a declining use of proprietary software, and it's being essentially at the expense of open source. Open source is eating proprietary software. And then finally, another interesting fact from the report is that 83% of enterprises are saying that open source was instrumental to their ability to embrace cloud architectures. So IBM has been around for over 100 years, and in fact, I like to say that IBM was doing open source before it was cool. We actually had engineers who are working on contributing into the Linux kernel back in the earlier 1990s. And we actually came out towards the end of the 1990s with $1 billion investment in Linux. And we also helped to establish the Linux Foundation in 2000. Additionally, before the turn of the century, we also helped to create the Apache Software Foundation. We did that because the project that we had been building out around in our new brand for e-business called WebSphere was based on the Apache HTTP server. And we felt that it needed to be developed in a community under open governance. And so we established the Apache Software Foundation, the Apache license. And IBM was very instrumental in that. We were also instrumental in contributing a number of technologies, including some XML and web services capabilities, big data, analytics, and so forth. So, this has obviously been something of importance to IBM over time. And as you see here, in terms of our commitment to open source, we do more than just consume it. We actually contribute to its development. And, so, again, I talked about Apache and Linux in their early days. We also helped to establish the Eclipse Foundation with a contribution of a significant piece of work in our Java IDE framework. Again, that's been very successful over time. We participated and led, in many sense, the development of HTML5. We were the co-chair of the HTML5 working group at the W3C. For many of you may not realize this, but IBM's acquisition of Cloudant is actually based on CouchDB from Apache. that we still to this day have a number of engineers that are collaborating, contributing to the development of CouchDB. A lot of our big data and analytics was built on top of Hadoop and Spark, and we made many contributions back into those communities. I personally was involved in helping to bring OpenStack to IBM and collaborated with many in the industry to help establish the OpenStack Foundation, and to bring that as to establish that within IBM as IBM's go-to infrastructure as a service offering. Same thing with Cloud Foundry. I worked closely with the folk at Pivotal and with the Linux Foundation, and we established the Cloud Foundry Foundation, and that the software there under Cloud Foundry became the foundation for IBM's platform as a service offering, Bluemix. We've been involved with Docker development for quite some period of time, and we also helped to establish the Open Container Initiative, the OCI, under the Linux Foundation, where we're doing some standardization around container formats and so forth. Cloud Native Computing Foundation is another initiative that IBM was in at from the beginning, and we are in the process of developing a number of the projects there underneath the CNCF, including Kubernetes and many of the others. We've been heavily involved in the development of and the creation of OpenJS and the Node community. I should sort of highlight the fact that IBM was actually instrumental in helping to sort of bring the two Node factions, if you will, Node.js and IO.js, back together and under a single open governance construct where the development of Node has really flourished. And that's all been merged in with the OpenJS Foundation now. And I'll talk in a little bit about the work we're doing around Hyperledger and IBM's interest in blockchain. Consumption is one thing, but we have to also contribute back. And again, we call this a harmonic or a virtuous cycle. Contributions to the community help foster trust, build innovation, and encourages partnership to grow the community and help it sustain itself. The continuous improvement then is sort of brought back, and it helps to reinforce the consumption aspect of things, right? You want bug fixes, you want new features, and so forth. And so helping to ensure the sustainability and the stability, the robustness of a community around a piece of software that's developed in open source is a fundamental part of the whole ethos of open source. And IBM has definitely felt that this is important. And we also feel that it's important for not just for the vendors, but for the consumers of technology to also be involved in contributing. And it doesn't always have to be contributions of code. Contributions can be documentation improvements, bug fixes, and even evangelism of the technology is a means of contributing to the development of open source capabilities. And IBM hasn't sort of piled on with others. We've also contributed a lot of our own internally developed capabilities out into open source. Early in the life of Apache, IBM made contributions of two fundamental projects for the XML ecosystem, Apache Xerces and Apache Xamarin, which is an XSLT parser. And again, those were really fundamental to the development of the whole XML web services ecosystem. IBM's Java runtime environment, OpenJ9, was recently open sourced. And again, we participate obviously in OpenJDK as well. Open Liberty is essentially the if you will, the open version of what had been the WebSphere platform. It is now fully open source, and it's I think a testament to the fact that IBM feels that even its most precious brands should be based on a solid foundation of open source. And again, when you think about, from the perspective of innovation, are these really innovations, or are we sort of just putting out what's, sort of been around for a while and we're putting it out to pasture? Not even close. Take a look at up in the upper right-hand quadrant there, Qiskit. Qiskit it's about 4 years old now, but this is IBM's Quantum SDK, Quantum Software Development Kit. that pairs with the IBM Q or quantum experience. And we open sourced this 4 years ago because we felt fundamentally that if we're going to be successful in developing quantum computing capabilities, we need to grow a community around just defining, pardon me, how do you interact with a quantum computer? How do you interact with it, right? How do you program it? And so Qiskit has been around now for 4 years. It's really quite successful, and we're looking forward to some future developments around that. Most recently, we published something called Project Elira, pardon me, which is some extensions to Jupyter notebooks that allow you to integrate AI capabilities in your notebooks. Recently, we also announced that Open Horizon, which is our edge computing platform that had been open source, was contributed into the Linux Foundation Edge project, the LF Edge. And so we're very proud of that. But open source isn't just for software, right? IBM Plex is actually a font. And so we open source that font system. Carbon Design System is a set of design language capabilities that we've open sourced. So again, design thinking turned into open source. And then finally, we have Open Power. Open Power is essentially an open source version of the PowerPC platform. And so we've completely opened up the PowerPC platform for open source. We publish a number of AI capabilities, AI fairness, AI explainability, and AI robustness toolkit, and making contributions of those technologies into the LFAI project. So, you know, again, it's really been sort of across the board where IBM has been contributing significant capabilities out into open source. And you'll notice that when we do make these types of contributions, once they start getting a foothold, we like to make sure that they find themselves in a context of open governance. And so these three organizations, the Apache Software Foundation, the Eclipse Software Foundation, and the Linux Foundation, are three of the communities that we like to work with. We feel that they've done a fantastic job of creating an environment, like I said, a safe place to collaborate and innovate. So you think about Apache started as a single project and now has almost 300. And some of them had nothing to do with the original purpose of the Apache Foundation. Same thing with Eclipse. Eclipse started as a single project, the Eclipse Java IDE framework, and it is now almost 400 projects. Many of them have nothing to do with Java or IDEs or the original purpose of the foundation. But the reason for that is because all three of these communities have essentially established governance models that are very effective, help people build these smaller communities around a technology, around a capability. And they do so in a way that ensures that there's not going to be any one single vendor that's dominating, and that the technology can evolve based on the needs of the community rather than on what some companies want to have happen. And that brings me to the last piece here, which is IBM's contributions into Hyperledger. So I'll tell you a little story about how this all came about. Basically, about 5 years ago, I was approached by Jerry Cuomo, who's an IBM Fellow. He said he'd been working on developing some blockchain technology for the enterprise. They'd taken a look at Bitcoin and Ethereum and a few of the other projects that were out there, and they felt that they didn't really fit the bill from an enterprise perspective. You know, how are enterprises going to use these technologies in their systems, in their solutions? And so I said to him, I said that I thought that if you really wanted this to be successful, if you really want to create sort of a whole ecosystem and community, you really need to take this out into open source. We weren't going to be successful if it was just IBM blockchain. And so we created the Linux Foundation. I work with the LF, Jim Zemlin, and a few people, and we created Hyperledger. And we had initial membership of about 22 companies, has since grown to about 250. We have about 16 projects ongoing. We have, meetup groups around the globe in I think 75 countries with like 62,000 participants in our global meetup community. It's really quite impressive. And the technologies that we're developing there, I mentioned we have like 16 different projects. We have 6 DLT or distributed ledger type projects. And of those, Hyperledger Fabric, which was what IBM had originally contributed, is probably the most notable. And it's been adopted by 10 of the largest cloud providers that are offering Hyperledger Fabric as a service. And then you have systems integrators and various other companies offering either technology and or solutions or services around the technologies that we're building out in Hyperledger. So it really has become, sort of really the go-to place for enterprise blockchain and open source. And so, again, you can get a sense for what you can accomplish when you put something under open governance, put it out as open source, and let the community sort of take off. It really is quite impressive. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to Joan. Thank you.